friends, and welcome back to Ghouls Night In, the spooky chat show with your best ghoul friends. I'm Penny Snark,
And I'm Midge Munster.
and welcome to 2024, Midge.
Happy New Year! Very exciting to be doing the first Ghouls Night episode of 2024.
Yes, so when I was getting ready, thinking about what I wanted to do this week, I was like, I should really do something positive and uplifting
So
for
this
the new
episode's
year.
about death, is what you're
Yeah, I'm
telling
gonna
me.
say, but I did not do that. I have something dark
Yeah,
for you.
that's always how
Uh,
Penny's trains of thought start out. It's like, I should do something fun and perky. And it's like, let's talk about bodies on Everest.
right. Well, this was as I often do. I was, lying awake in the night, thinking
Sure,
thoughts, and my
sure.
brain was just like, you know what, you should talk about Jack the Ripper.
Oh, okay, cool.
So I don't think anyone here is going to be surprised that I also had a Jack the Ripper phase when I was in school.
Now,
Uh,
I think you need to clarify. Does that mean you were interested in him or that you were committing
I
similar
was I
acts?
was just ripping,
I
you
was
know
just
me.
ripping.
I was
You know how
ripping.
I be.
All right. Before we get into this, just a disclaimer. Obviously, this is a very complicated and not a very pleasant story. I'm not going to get into any gory details. If you want like a full true crime breakdown, I'm sure there are lots of other really great podcasts for that. But I more want to talk about kind of like the mythology of Jack the Ripper, how he came to prominence, and why it has remained a piece of so much interest over all these years. Because like this happened at the end of the 1800s, and when I was
Mhm.
doing research for this episode and like just straight up Google Jack the Ripper, there are still newspaper articles like speculating
Yeah,
about his identity now. Like it's still considered click worthy today, which is pretty crazy.
it is. It's definitely a vital piece of history, even though it's very sad.
Yes. So we will start with the basics. So Jack the Ripper is the name that was given to a possible killer of probably five women in Whitechapel over 3 months in 1888. If that sounds weird and vague, that's because everything about this is actually kind of squiffy.
Yeah, not squiffy.
It's squiffy. It is squiffy. So there are what is referred to as five canonical victims of Jack the Ripper, which is Mary Ann Nichols, starting on August 31st of 1888, followed by Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and then finally Mary Jane Kelly on November 9th, 1888. So these are generally connected due to the fact that they all occurred at night on a near a weekend near the end of the month with a similar method of death and treatment of the body. Several of these women were reported to be dead only a short time before being discovered. So, like, people were like, she was still warm and things like that.
Mm,
But there were, like, never really reliable witnesses. And this is before even fingerprinting had been
sure. Yeah.
invented. So there's functionally zero evidence.
Just like a
Um,
time when people could just get away with stuff.
yep, you just do whatever you want. So those are the five that are kind of generally considered to be Ripper victims. However, there are 11 murders of women from February. So as I said, the first like canonical one is August. And then stretching into 1891 in the Whitechapel area that could potentially be Ripper murders. And of course, this case, spoiler alert, becomes a media sensation. There are random murders around Europe that people try to like attach to this. Or if you feel like going in the opposite direction, these five were grouped and kind of considered to be the victims in the period and the time. And there are people today who don't even believe those people were killed by the same person. um,
Mm,
so it is kind of a question mark there. And one of the things you may have noticed that I did not say about Jack the Ripper's victims, that is kind of the common thread, is that they were sex workers. This was
mhm.
something that was very widely reported at the time. The media, it was very much part of like this lurid news story about like bad women leaving dangerous lives who,
Sure.
maybe they deserved what they got. Does that sound sadly
Classic. Yeah.
familiar?
Yeah.
Yep. They were often described as degenerates or unfortunates in the press. So, in my research, there is a book by Hallie Rubenhold called The Five: The Untold Lives of the Women Killed by Jack the Ripper. That was the first book that was really focusing on the victims instead of like trying to put forward a theory about the killer, which is
Mhm.
super shitty because this just came out in 2019.
Yeah.
So I have not read this yet. I am very interested in it, but I did read some interviews with her as I was prepping this. And she actually argues that there's only proof that two of the five women had any history with sex work, and most of them were certainly impoverished, were likely sleeping on the streets. Obviously, whether or not someone is a sex worker has no bearing on how sad their death is, but it is just a kind of an example of how the press was really circling and promoting parts of the narrative that don't necessarily have any basis in reality.
Right. Well, and
So
yeah,
it's
what a shocking discovery that we tried to make this the fault of the victims that
right.
were women.
How weird.
Yeah, that's
Good
never
thing that
happened.
doesn't
Good
happen
thing that
anymore.
stopped immediately after the 1800s. Yeah, thank
Right.
goodness.
So this is really the first major crime that had this kind of media coverage. And that's for the reason that really this is like the first time that kind of media existed in the omnipresent way that we think
Mhm.
about it now. So there were more newspapers than ever during this time. Papers were cheaper than they'd ever been, and more of the poor and lower classes, therefore, like of the entire population, were actually literate, which created a huge spike in creation and consumption of news content. I found one source that said that during the time of the kind of Ripper murders, the most popular paper at the time, The Star, was selling 300,000 copies a day.
Oh my gosh, wow.
So like the people were crazy for this, like
Hungry for it, yeah.
hungry for it. And I mean, honestly, like as I was reading about it, I was like, oh, so this is exactly like social media.
Right, yeah.
Because it was just tons of speculation, stuff that was, just plain made up because the papers were looking for stuff that they could print, every single day
Yeah,
about
and
this
people thought
case.
that because it was written on official paper, it must be true.
Right. So as we kind of talked about, there was a lot of villainizing, not just of like the women themselves, but also just people who lived in the Whitechapel area. Like these were really crappy parts of town. Like there are a lot of poor people. There was lots of xenophobic and of course anti-Semitic theories about the killer, because they're like, of course, this must be some, horrifying
Yeah,
non-white brute who is trawling around.
of course.
So of course, So the first name that was actually attached to the killer that we know today as Jack the Ripper was Leather Apron,
Oh,
which, right, I know, upsetting.
giving
And
American Mary.
yeah.
Ugh.
So this was a reference to, apparently there was a man that some local women had complained were harassing them, who, surprise, wore a leather apron, like a butcher or another like workman of the times. And this was after the initial murder of Mary Nichols in August. So people were like right away being like, we got to name this thing. Like, what's going on?
Mhm.
And the name Jack the Ripper actually comes from one of the letters that was supposedly sent by the killer. So there is what is now called the Dear Boss letter, which was received on September 27th, 1888. So, like, kind of in the middle of
Mhm, like
everything going on.
the peak
And it
of it, yeah.
was, yep, it was signed Jack the Ripper, which was the first appearance of the name.
It's not funny, but I'm picturing, like, if it was the same person, right?
Mhm.
That they're, like, upset, like, they're like, "Oh, leather it can't be
Right. They're like,
leather
leather
apron, that's
apron.
so lame. I want a
Hate that.
cool name like Jack the Ripper."
Right. Much better. Much better. So unsurprisingly, this was one of just like hundreds of letters that were sent to the papers. This one was also assumed to be a hoax when it came in, like any of the other ones. But it did rise to kind of prominence because the letter references cutting off a woman's ear and sending it to the police. And in the following murder of Catherine Eddowes, her part of her ear was cut, although neither her or anyone's ear was ever sent to the police. So I'm kind of
Mhm.
like, I don't know how strong of a connection
Sure.
this is. Like that, it does sound like the kind of thing that you might just say if you were writing a crazy letter.
If you were an insane person sending a
If you
letter,
were a crazy
sure.
person sending a letter.
Makes sense.
Um, so the other two missives that are kind of frequently believed to potentially be from the real killer was the Saucy Jack postcard. This refer yeah, I know they all have great
Mm.
names. It refers back to some of the contents of the Dear Boss letter, and it had similar handwriting. And then there is the From Hell letter, which is notable because it was delivered with half of a human kidney.
Oh,
Which,
well, yeah,
yep,
that'll do it.
yep. And that is one of the body parts that was removed from a Ripper victim. But of course, they had no way of knowing whose kidney that
Right,
was.
there's no DNA,
There's no
right.
DNA, there's no anything. So they were just kind of like, well, this is a kidney. That's messed up. um,
Damn, that's crazy.
that's
Anyway, here's
crazy.
Wonderwall. Yeah.
Pretty much. There are a bunch of other letters that people argue whether they're legitimate or not. And of course, there are plenty of people who doubt that any of these letters are legitimate. There was a journalist of the time who supposedly confessed in the 30s to making up letters,
Oh, I'm sure
which
for,
of
like,
course they
paper
did.
sales,
Yeah.
yeah, of
Yeah,
course.
of course they did.
Well, and of course, there's, anything like this where there's a media frenzy, you're gonna have copycats, you're gonna have
Yep.
people who idolize the killer and doing weird shit like yeah,
Right.
there's absolutely no way without forensics to determine that any of that is
Yes.
even kind of true.
Pretty much. And like honest, that was kind of like I'm like in the end we really know basically nothing about
Yeah,
this.
which is
And I mean,
wild.
yeah, and I think that's why it, has stuck around, because there
Mhm.
are so many empty gaps for people to fill in either, I mean, illegitimately in the press or as we will talk about in fiction. So like there's the case obviously was never solved. There were never really any solid suspects. So Jack the Ripper really kind of became a boogeyman like immediately in the time. Like people
Yeah.
were talking about him. Keeping, like I said, there were, reports that it's like, oh, there was, a murder in Germany. Maybe Jack the Ripper did it. And it's
He's on
like,
the move.
he's on the move. So kind of the general assumption, but that most historians, you know what I mean.
Historic people? Yeah.
Historic people. Well, I think it was also of people in history at the time. They kind of think that after that fifth killing, that the person was either killed or like put in an institution or arrested for something else. And that's
Mhm.
kind of the accepted, I would say, theory of the case. But who knows? Um, so you know how sometimes we feel like, whoa, like too soon when people announce that they're making like movies or miniseries about crimes these days because
Uh-huh.
they like make them right away. I
Yeah.
would definitely say too soon to John Francis Brewer, who published a Gothic novel that featured Catherine Eddowes' murder as a plot point in October 1888,
Oh, like 2 months later?
while the murders were still actively happening. Like the last canonical victim isn't until November. Like it was literally ongoing, and he was like, you know what, this is going in my novel.
That's wild. Bram Stoker's people wouldn't even let him fully publish Dracula because of Jack the Ripper.
Yeah, John Francis Brewer was like, what's up?
Just kicks down the door. "What's up, bitches?
I've got a Gothic novel.
Boy, have I got a novel for you."
Right. So there
That's
can,
wild.
yeah, I know. I was like, oh, I was because it was like, oh, the media like on the fiction started like not like quickly, and I was like, oh yeah, like probably like the next year would be like, whoa, you started writing this while it was happening, and now it's published. And this guy was just like, nope, I'm on it.
Jeez.
I'm on it. Also, I'm like, how fast are you writing, bro?
Yeah, no kidding. Unless he already had, like, a kind of a murder
Yeah,
novel written and then was like, "Boy, this is gonna be the hot ticket." Like, just
right.
plug in the details and
Right,
sell it.
probably.
Oh, wow, that's
Yeah,
rough.
crazy. So there continue to be novels and short stories about Jack the Ripper worldwide into the 1900s. Of course, also nonfiction attempts to interpret the evidence and put forward your theories. There was apparently a big trend for Jack the Ripper and Sherlock Holmes stories, um,
Sure.
which makes sense. I mean, you got to get the world's greatest detective on this
On the
case
biggest unsolved
on the
mystery,
biggest
yeah.
unsolved mystery. There are stage shows and operas about Jack the Ripper as a character. And of course, once people started making film and TV, there was plenty of that too. There are actually multiple Hammer horror films inspired by Jack the Ripper.
Mm,
My favorite being Hands of the Ripper, in which Jack the Ripper's daughter is possessed by his spirit and forced to murder people.
gay, love that.
Right?
We love
Crazy.
when there's a weird femme daughter twist to
Right,
a
I was gonna say, old
giving
horror loves
Dracula's daughter.
loves a killer's daughter trope.
Yes.
Um,
Isn't, am I crazy? Isn't the song "Mac the Knife" supposed to be about
yeah,
Jack the Ripper?
I think it's
Or
connected
it's
to Jack
it
the
connected to
Ripper,
him
yeah.
somehow? Like, he's
Mhm.
that killer is, thought to be, like, the father of the guy who ended up being, I don't know, there's some connection there, I remember.
Yeah, there were so many connections
Oh,
that,
I
like,
believe, yeah.
as I was going through, I'm like, "Alright, we're gonna pick out a few
Yeah.
famous
Take a
because,
selection of Ripper lore.
yeah, this is, like, really going everywhere." I mean, obviously, there's some inspiration, Jack the Ripper ties in with Sweeney Todd
Oh, of
and
course, yeah.
other things. Something that I thought was interesting is like as time progresses, you kind of see how like the theories shift with along with like social shifts.
Mhm.
So at the time, like we mentioned, it was generally kind of imagined that the Ripper was like some kind of foreigner or strange, person. But by like the 1960s, it was very common to be like, oh, the Ripper was secretly part of the upper class and was like,
People were realizing with forensics that most killers were rich white men.
right? They're like, did a rich white man do this? Probably.
Probably.
But I think that also like because I definitely feel like I see both representations of Jack the Ripper as like very like animalistic and like
Mhm.
brutal, but there's also kind of this weird undertone of like sort of like a
A
gentleman
gentleman.
murderer,
I've
which
literally always, like, when if you said that to me, if you just said Jack the Ripper, I'm, like, picturing him in a top hat.
right, yeah.
100%, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that became like a very prominent kind of thing where we're like, "Oh wait, was it a rich guy?" And like on one hand, I'm like, "Yes, of course, obviously, it's always a terrible white man." um but on the other hand, I'm kind of like, "Ooh, are we kind of like admiring this guy and being like, "Oh, to have,
Mm,
evaded capture, he must have been, wealthy and clever." Kind of vibe, which I also don't
sure.
love. So there's no winning here. One thing. So I will say probably like kind of like at the heart of my like Jack the Ripper media experience is From Hell, the graphic novel by Alan Moore and Eddie Campbell.
Mm,
This is based very strongly on a theory by Stephen Knight. He wrote a book called Jack the Ripper: The Final Solution, which has been like vastly disproved
mhm.
and is like not at all true. And even in the appendix for the book, Alan Moore is like, I don't believe this, but it's cool. So I made a comic about it.
Perfect.
Um, so this version goes all the way up to Prince Albert being involved in the Ripper murders, Freemasons. That's the kind of stuff you got
It's
to
like
know.
a full, national treasure conspiracy.
Pretty much, yeah. And that was because really the first Ripper book I read was. See, now I'm forgetting the title of it. It was Patricia Cornwall's book, but that is also that like it's the theory that like this artist, Walter Sickert, was Jack the Ripper because he
Mm.
was kind of like a weirdo, basically at
Mhm,
that
mhm.
time who was like into the case. But it's really all based on like information from the Stephen Knight book, which is like not factual. So
It would be
it
hard for me to believe that there was a conspiracy wrapped around it, because I feel like if that were the case, the murders would be more like attacking specific people, I guess.
yeah.
You know, like trying to like get rid of prominent people in some way or something. Like
Yeah.
the fact that it's like a man aggressing women doesn't seem particularly conspiracy linked to me.
Yeah, the so I don't want to get into it, but it's like basically there's like a thought that one of these women was potentially linked to like an illegitimate child of the royalty. And so it was kind of
Mm.
like, oh, they killed her, but then they
But
kept
they
killing
hid it.
other people to hide it, kind of thing.
Oh,
Is
okay,
sort of
okay,
the
okay.
vibe there. It is not likely to be true, but it is an
Sure.
interesting thing to read about. So Jack the Ripper has also been in video games. He's in anime where he's so I have not watched this anime, but apparently in a show called Black Butler, which I have heard about, they like go back in time and find out that it's of course it's like, oh, this was actually a man and a demon that was
Of
doing this,
course.
like you do.
I hate
Um,
when there's a secret demon that I didn't know about.
Secret demons making you murder. And I will wrap it up by saying that a Jack the Ripper museum opened in 2015, which you may remember for causing a lot of blowback on the internet and criticism because it was presented to the Planning Commission as a women's history museum. And
Oh
apparently,
no.
people didn't know until they put up the marquee that it was actually a Jack the Ripper museum. So that's gross.
Oh boy, I missed that whole thing. That's rough.
Yeah, yeah. They're still open, as far as I can see. I probably would not go there.
Yeah.
But there you go. Yeah, I know this was kind of like a mishmash sort of episode, but I just kind of wanted to talk about this weird and wacky case, and it's just one of those things where it's like the more I try to put my hands around it, the more I'm like, there's nothing here. There's
Yeah.
nothing to hold on to. And I know people are like, oh, I'd love to know the mystery. And I'm like, this is just something that we will never know. Like, we're never going to
Yeah, but
know.
those are, and
Because
it, like you said, it makes sense why it's prevailed, because that those are the most intriguing things, is the stuff we
it's
can't
true.
understand, you know?
Yep, continues to be a mystery. And obviously we also have like a lot of other killers are named in the style of Jack the Ripper, both in real life and, for example, in the Hannibal universe, we have the
Mhm.
Chesapeake Ripper.
Yep.
So there, people continue to be ripping.
People be ripping.
People be ripping, and mysteries remain unsolved. And I definitely want to check out this book about the women who were killed because they are the ones who had the worst time of this, and especially with no respect from the press.
Mhm. Definitely. I'm glad someone's compiled that. That's
Yeah,
good, at least.
agreed.
Even if it did come 100 years later.
Right. All right. Well, that is me. If any of you guys have a Jack the Ripper fixation, if you have a favorite piece of media featuring this wicked character, let us know. But thank you so much for listening and for joining us here in this new year. If you enjoyed the show, we would love it if you would leave us a review on your podcast app of choice. It really helps us spread the word about our show. And I think Midge has some semi-related nice words to
Some
share today.
semi-related nice words. Well, speaking of killers, from the the
Hey.
turn of the century there, we, as y'all know, our last episode of the year was the kit bag reading of our Victorian Christmas tale, and we uploaded a video version of that to my YouTube channel as well. If you haven't checked that out yet, you can head over to YouTube and search Midge Munster. It's right on there for you. But we figured maybe today for something a little different, we would read some comments from that video because
Yes.
y'all had a lot to say and were so fun over there. So I'm going to read a selection of comments from that, starting with Sabrina Lopez, who said, "Never had so much fun while folding laundry. I could listen to you two tell spooky stories for hours. Thank you."
Mhm.
I also, my personal favorite that I pulled out here is from uh, Jack Quigg, I believe is the name, and says, "It's almost midnight. I live alone. Why the fuck am I listening to this right now?"
Hope you don't have a kit bag on your floor.
So, for you, that here's another episode about a killer. Don't listen to it too late.
You're welcome.
You're welcome. And then let's see. As a final one here, I will pull from TLR. I'm sure that this is. You ever try to read it and you're like, that's probably a word. I'm just not saying
Yeah.
it. TLR Appley said, "Loved this, ladies. Thank you. Keep those tales coming. Now I need to find the nursemaid's tale too. Merry Creepmas and a happy new year."
Aw.
So thank you all so much for tuning into that episode, for checking us out over on YouTube outside of our usual format. We had a lot of fun making that for you, and we're so glad you enjoyed it.
Yes. And once again, Happy New Year to all of you. Hopefully, it is spooky.
Yes, but not
That's
too
that's my
spooky.
that's my only wish. Delightfully spooky.
Delightfully spooky.
Delightfully spooky. If you would like some more delightfully spooky content in your life, you can follow our podcast on Instagram at Ghouls Night In Pod, and you can find me across the internet at Penny Snark.
And I am all over the web at Midge Munster.
And until next time, goodbye.
Goodbye.